Good afternoon. I hope you're having a great time at the conference so far. I'm pleased to be able to be the chair here for panel number 4 today, this afternoon. My name's Anthony Furey. I'm a national columnist for the Post Media Papers and morning show host on the Sirius XM national channel here in Canada. So I'm sorry I couldn't be here this morning, but I was on the air for a few hours. And thank you to Karsten for joining me on air to talk about the conference on this morning's program. It's always a great pleasure to join my friends at the Mackenzie Institute for an important conversation such as this. And the Albany Club as well is a facility really interested in national security issues. I was last here speaking about a book that I have, which I guess gives me a tiny ounce of credibility to be chairing a panel on this important complex subject, Pulse Attack, the story about the secret weapon that can destroy North America, although electromagnetic pulse warfare is not so secret anymore after North Korea made a big threat about it back in September. It's a great pleasure to lead this conversation. I think it's a really exciting one. It's not, the topic of the panel that we're going to discuss right now is not an assertion, but a question. Can there really be cybersecurity? And I think from a layman's term, you kind of shrug and go, yeah, just change your Facebook password every 3 months and then you're done. And then you step back and you think about it for a second, and you try and look at all the headlines that affect so many different industries and sectors. Here in Canada, we had a university recently that paid high amounts of ransom for being victim of a cyber security attack. We talk about major departments in Canada and the United States that every day are bombarded by cyber attacks that threaten our security. They're doing an investigation in the United States about people disingenuously buying Facebook ads at impolite times, and I guess that would fall under the rubric of it too. And then the basic fact of our changing nature of warfare. Several hundred years ago, wars took, about 30 years. Then we got it down to about 30 months. We were doing pretty well now. Now we're told wars might only take 30 minutes or less because of the emerging nature of cyber warfare. So it obviously covers the rubric of the business sector, military, academy, governance, personal security, and so much more. So I'm looking forward to hearing from our 4 panelists who have a great deal of wealth and a great wealth of expertise in this subject, and a variety of it too. I'll introduce everyone, and then I'm going to ask everybody to make a sort of initial little presentation for a few minutes on the subject. Liz Shirley here's the Technical Director of Intelligence and Tech Analysis at WAPAC Labs and Red Sky Alliance, and she is an active duty veteran of the U.S. Air Force and U.S. Navy Reserves as a Chinese Mandarin crypto-linguist and an intelligence analyst. Imran Ahmad is a business law partner in the Toronto office of Miller Thomson here in this city and specializes in the areas of cybersecurity, technology, and privacy law. And Stuart Wright was an executive with Enbridge, where he was head of the project management office and provides regulatory risk strategy and business management services to a whole variety of sectors. He has 20 years of experience in energy, cybersecurity, and risk management. And at the end of the table there, Mr. Carl Hayes, Vice President of Business Development for Stratagem, creator of Canada's first cloud-based security as a service. And prior to joining Stratagem, he spent 5 years with a leading North American security integrator. So my first sort of thought of what we could maybe talk about today is just how broad the term cybersecurity is. And I wanted to ask all of you to just define the term based on your own experience, what you think cybersecurity is, and then also what you think the main challenge is within your specialty and the work you're doing right now. Liz?
Well, I'd say 20 years ago, we started out with a diagram that involved a triangle, and availability was on top, confidentiality was on one side, and integrity is on the other side for data integrity. We are still using that same paradigm, and we are still losing. And so I'm your worst case scenario person. That's what I did for the intelligence community, figuring out what are the worst things our enemies were going to do to us. And fighting cybersecurity thus far has been a losing retroactive game. We're always playing catch up. We're always trying to fix the fire, put it out. We're never getting ahead of the game. And some of the things that we need to look at are figuring out, I hate to use the risk and liabilities, but there are better ways of handling those risks and liabilities. And when you engage with business partners, making sure that you understand and have agreements across the board and better collaboration, because that's where we fall through a lot of times. It's not just patching and maintenance, but it's our business agreements with our vendors, our suppliers, and making sure that they're following through on compliance and having those agreements in place and contractually. I hate to say it when I get into a conference with a lot of financial institutions, but risk and liabilities are an equation. And what you want to do, selfishly, is take those risks and liabilities and move them over to the other side of the equation and spread it around so that you're not the only person here with egg on your face. If something happens with one of your vendors or your suppliers, make them responsible. Make them be aware of the same security procedures that you have to follow, they have to follow it, and have that in a contractual agreement. And when you do mergers and acquisitions, do your due diligence. It's not just looking at the accounting books, it's looking at what their cyber status is. Have they had a breach? Look at Yahoo and Verizon. That is a big mess to have to go afterwards and clean up. And one of the biggest things, ironically, is PR. When the case study for Tylenol, when there were bottles got out that were poisoned, it's now taught at Harvard that how they got ahead of that as far as PR is concerned, and saying, here, let's recall it, let's do something. There are certain requirements you have when you suffer a data breach that are already legal requirements, and you can get ahead of the problem in a PR standpoint that can make or break your company as far as your stock prices go. So making sure you do those due diligence and have an agreement where everybody sitting at the table is a stakeholder and only one person isn't left holding the bag at the end of the day.
Thanks, Liz. Imran.
So just before I get started, I want to thank the conference organizers for the invitation, and very happy to be here with you all. So, you know, when you asked the question, something came to mind. About 10 years ago, when I started the first cybersecurity practice at my old firm, I went around the firm and especially to the senior partners in the firm and said, you know, you guys should lead this. We want to start a cybersecurity group, and you should be leading this initiative. And their first reaction was, what the hell is cybersecurity? I've been doing data protection for 15, 20 years now. Like, how is this any different? And the example I gave them, and I still believe it's true when you talk to the corporate folks or anybody who's in the cybersecurity world, is it's broader than just privacy. It's broader than just litigation. It's broader than just insurance. There's multiple aspects to it that apply. And when you look at it, there's tons of definitions that are out there. You can look at NIST or ISO, there's under standards which are define the status of protecting your network or protecting digital assets within an organization. There's variations to that definition. But broadly speaking, for an organization, it's securing its assets, making sure it's secure from all aspects that are key, including reputational harm, operational efficiencies, and so on. So cyber is sort of a catch-all term, I find, in many ways. From a legal perspective, there's all kinds of connotation to it, but it's a much bigger umbrella issue than just simply looking at privacy from a narrow standpoint, or just data protection from a very narrow standpoint.
Stuart.
It's funny, in the last 18 months, we've been struggling trying to actually define what cybersecurity is. And I'm going to read you a definition in terms of what I believe cyber means. It means a body of technologies, processes, and practices designed to protect networks, computers, programs, data, as my colleague had mentioned, and personal information from attack, damage, and unauthorized access. It includes both electronic and physical security. Now that is a refined definition to try to meet a regulatory, legalistic definition. What does it actually mean? It means that we're trying to protect our critical infrastructure, our assets, and our personal information from being used without our authorization for nefarious reasons. You mentioned, I guess another question was in terms of what are the main challenges here? The main challenge I've seen here is that we all have different definitions for cybersecurity. In fact, we spell it differently from every jurisdiction. The biggest risk I see, or the biggest challenge I see, is that we can't communicate between each other about what those cyber risks are and how to respond to them appropriately. So I'll speak to that perhaps a little bit more later, but I think that's fundamentally the crux of the problem here.
Carl?
I think part of the benefit of going last is that I have the the benefit of listening to my colleagues and just admitting that my definition is no different than theirs. So I thought I'd take a little bit of a different take on the question that's being raised and tell you what I think cybersecurity is not. Cybersecurity is not building an impenetrable fortress that will mitigate you or your business from being the victim of a breach. We've seen this countless times, and we will continue to see this countless times in the future. Recent examples this year that were very public and made international headlines include successful breaches at Deloitte. John's not here anymore, by the way, so I think I can say that openly. Successful breaches at Deloitte, the SEC, and of course Equifax. And rest assured that these are global enterprises whose annual IT cybersecurity spend would dwarf the top line revenue of many small to medium-sized enterprises. And so the fact of the matter is that clearly, even with the spending the money on the technology, on the people, on the process, these organizations and many more, countless others that have been both made public and that are private, none of us know about, have fallen and continue to fall victim to a breach. And so therefore, I think that what cybersecurity is best defined as today, in perhaps a very rudimentary definition, is it's about risk mitigation. And it's therefore about understanding what is your risk posture and what is acceptable risk. Because fundamentally, you or a business are not going to spend, and I use this analogy, $1 million to protect a $1,000 asset. But that $1,000 asset or that vulnerability that remains open and exposed may be a means by which, in an off chance, you find yourself victim of a breach. And so, hopefully that gives you some perspective and a difference of opinion or a different take on the question at hand.
Yeah, no, great point there. And, Carl, when you talk about the whole kind of what your idea of your own risk assessment is, and then Liz, you were mentioning, have we even made great progress, over the years when you've been looking at it? I think of that Canadian university that had their computers locked, and I think the hackers wanted $20,000 or something to get the information released, and I guess they had a meeting and they said, okay, it's 20 grand if we can keep it out of the headlines, and then we don't have to pay 300 grand for some other system. We don't really understand this, but just pay the guy. Do you feel whether we're talking the private clients or sort of public sector stuff, do all of you, and I'd like to ask all of you this question, do you find that the current attitude is just encouraging the bad actors to keep doing their stuff?
Well, in the cybersecurity industry, we always say that there are companies that have been breached and there's companies that don't know they've been breached yet. So one of the issues that we've come across with ransomware is we have a new service offering across many of the United States cybersecurity vendors where we're now offering, we'll negotiate with the ransomware actors for you, because it has become such a big issue and they don't want that becoming public. They don't want to deal with it. But we've literally had cases of hospitals being affected where it was imminent, and we've had, we'll say petrochemical companies where the children of the employees were targeted. So, it comes down to that, and the businesses just don't want to take the chance, but they also don't want to be seen negotiating directly, so they have third-party negotiate. And one of the problems within the United States is it's very difficult to obtain a whole bunch of Bitcoin all at once. So having a company that offers that where we can obtain Bitcoin over a period of time for you because of our regulations and how you can do Bitcoin within the United States.
Bitcoin to give to the ransom?
Yeah, to get it into the wallet, to make purchases. We're limited on like $1,000 purchase per day. So we have to have people do it across a multitude of days for different wallets in order to be able to transfer something like, they generally will ask for something like 3 million. And the only ransomware that we haven't seen where the people paid was the NotPetya. Because one of the things is there is honor among ransomware because people will quit paying. This is an enterprise. This is a business. These aren't just the guys who are on drugs breaking into your car. This is what they do all day long. They're sitting there doing this for a living. It's a 9-to-5 job. So you have to think of it in that respect. A lot of these aren't kids, these are grown people who literally this is their daily job. They go in, this is their job, this is their work.
Imran, and you said in your opening remarks about the other partners at the firm going, well, this is not really a big deal, is it? But as Liz says, hospitals, they're affected by this, so this could end up being really life or death issues in some respects. Is the understanding of the severity getting there?
I think so. So I'm at a unique vantage point because the group I lead is national, and we serve multiple industries. And when clients call us, they're also benefiting from solicitor-client privilege. So we actually get more reporting to us than I think the Commissioner of Privacy gets at the federal level in many ways. So we can tell very quickly trends emerging. So I'll give you an example. In the U.S., when you had Hollywood Presbyterian being compromised, basically a significant multi-million-dollar ask in terms of a ransom, ultimately they ended up paying a fraction of that. I think it was $17,000, something in that range. What we noticed was through our health law practice, immediately the number of hospitals or healthcare facilities in Canada being either hit or being compromised increased significantly. Same thing happened when University of Calgary paid the ransom and publicly stated that they were happy to pay the ransom because their insurer was able to help them out with all kinds of vendors and what have you. We saw all kinds of universities across Canada where our clients are being hit right away. Same thing with the mining industry in Canada, which happened about a year and a half ago. So there's a direct correlation in terms of any public statement or even no public statement and just confidentially amongst hackers, that they know who's actually paying and who's not paying, to take that as an initiative to say, somebody's gonna pay and let's go ahead and do it. The other example I'll give you, last week I was in Calgary working with a pipeline client of ours. So this is an enterprise level pipeline client that goes from Canada to the US. Their senior leadership team wanted to do a tabletop exercise, which is basically a mock simulation. So we were there, a vendor was there, as well as their senior leadership team and their IT department. And these guys have literally, I think they had like 20 people in the room, and they had dedicated significant funds to having people in correct positions that you should have when you have these kind of issues at hand. And the scenario that was presented to them, let's say your system is compromised, so it's an application on your phone that your suppliers are going to be using for your oil and gas services. And you're basically going to be unoperable for the next X number of hours or days. And the hackers are asking for $250,000 in Bitcoin. Without even a hesitation, because this is a multi-billion-dollar pipeline, they said, we'll pay it. Who cares? Now, take that, if you just unpack that a little bit, the initial reaction is at the corporate level or at the business level is to just get operations up and running. Who cares? If it's an amount that we can pay, let's do it. Or if the insurance will cover cyber extortion, let's do it. The problem is, first of all, assuming they even give you the correct decryption key, you're lucky on that. Second of all, you sent a message that you're willing to pay. They'll hit you back with another vulnerability potentially in a couple of months or years or what have you. And so those are all kinds of other concerns. But the bigger concern for them, which actually tilted them the other way when we went through that scenario was, you're listed publicly. You have a public disclosure requirement. When you put in your financial statements, or if you put in your annual report, or you get onto an earnings call and somebody specifically asks you, have you paid a ransom? And what guarantee do you have that the funds were not used to fund criminal activity, or in the case of the US where it's much more pronounced, terrorist activities? Can you say yay or nay, or if you're silent, how is it going to be interpreted? And when you look at public companies, the same could also be applied at many levels for private companies for considerations. So I think at a high level, ransomware in particular, we're talking about one type of cyber attack here, so one kind of cyber threat, is a unique one, and organizations deal with them very differently depending on their size and scope. Often the ransoms are very small amounts, so it's not really material, but for large organizations to pay the $250 and up is a non-concern for them. So I think the awareness is going to increase over time, but it's not there yet necessarily.
These are excellent points, and please send my regards to Catherine. I guess many corporations seek cybersecurity standards to improve their posture and protect against these kind of cyber risks, the malware, the Trojans. Few, unfortunately, actively participate in these kind of national level discussions, if then even tangentially. More needs to be done. Collectively, we're strong. Individually, we're weak. We're talking about encouraging threat actors who will use whatever means and mechanisms. They'll recycle them. They'll keep hitting you. You may already be breached. We are aware that in many instances they'll come in, they'll assess your situation, pivot within your organization, find out your weak points, look at social media, which they've spoken to, and then basically exploit that at a time and appropriate to their choosing. Once they've sent you that ransomware, and and I've worked in operations, I recognize one of the biggest gaps from a cybersecurity awareness is you want to keep the lights on or the oil in the right side of the pipe. You don't want to have that disruption. And just for clarity, $250,000 is immaterial from any operational consideration in the energy sector. For Northern Gateway, as an example, the IT budget was $250 million, and that was a rounding error. So 250,000, they wouldn't even sneeze at to make a determination. The criticality is actually coming up with, okay, what is the threat intelligence? How is it being used? If we're being hit, who is the threat actor? What is the intent? How much damage can they occur with this intrusion? And how vulnerable are we? And then talking to, making a decision if you were the University of Calgary, if you've got cybersecurity insurance, what is the liability incurred, and what is the partner direct officer liability if we don't take action? And if you do have a regulatory report or your financial statements indicating a material breach, what are the implications of disclosing that, and what is the impact your brand harm and reputation? So we're talking about encouraging threat actors. You're going to go and publish that you've been breached and you've paid on your financial service report. Okay, let me think about that. Every Estonian gang, every Russian threat actor, every Chinese gang out there will say, wow, they've got deep pockets, they've got insurance, guess who I'm going to hit next? We're encouraging that kind of behavior. We need to think differently, we need to address that gap, and we need to respond in appropriate manner and recover in appropriate manner.
Carl, when Stuart said, together, singularly we can be strong, but sort of together we're weak, and I'm sort of hearing that it's putting out fires, it's triage, we're solving the problems, but then the overarching issue still exists. How does it become like an industry solution as opposed to a piecemeal?
Yeah, I think a couple of things, just to go back to some of the points that were made. I mean, first to the question itself. Does paying these ransoms motivate adversaries to launch additional attacks against either the same target or other targets? Well, I think the simple answer to that question is yes. I mean, it's if it's proven to be successful and there's been some form of financial gain or enrichment, and if that in fact was the underlying motive of the breach or of the security incident itself, well then, the adversary has met his objective. But again, it's a little bit more broader than just that sort of question or that discussion. I think you need to understand in these situations who, why, what. Who is the adversary? What is their motivation? Is their motivation, we're talking a lot about ransomware, and I understand the topical nature of ransomware in the news and its impact, to both individuals and to Canadian global enterprise. But ransomware is but one threat vector, within the entire cybersecurity realm that has the capability of causing significant harm. Whether that be in the form of disruption to business continuity, whether that be in the form of brand or reputational loss, the list goes on. So I think you need to be able to understand, those items in order. I want to address something that Imran had said with regards to getting the encryption key, that there's no guarantee that you're going to get the encryption key if you pay the ransom. And yet Dr. Jardine, we heard just at the previous panel, had said that according to his data analysis, I think it was 91% of those that paid the ransom got their data back, and got their data back very timely. So that proves, the empirical evidence would suggest, and this was not a statistic that I was familiar with prior to listening to your presentation, but the empirical evidence and data suggests that in fact this perhaps is the least painless way of going about dealing with this type of a situation. It's one thing to say, well, you know what, you should back up your data, you can go back in time. But we heard that some of the more sophisticated attacks and malware that's out there today remains dormant for months. And in fact, I would call your attention to the leading industry analysts in this space, whether you look at the likes of a Gartner, a Forrester's, IDC, FireEye's, M-Trends. They stipulate, depending on who you subscribe to, that the average amount of time that elapses before a successful breach has been identified is somewhere between 150 and 250 days. And it's in that period of time that the greatest damage is done. And so this is a very roundabout way of me going now back to the question that you had posed in terms of, you know, the strength of the collective and solutions for industry, et cetera. What I would simply suggest, and the comment was made earlier, you know, John Chambers, who's now the executive chairman, or at least I think he still is, the executive chairman of Cisco Systems, formerly its present CEO, famously has said that, you know, there are two types of businesses, those that don't know they've been breached and those that have been breached. And so if we recognize that there's nothing we can do, there's no undertaking large enough that we are incapable of keeping up with the new threat vectors, methods, et cetera, of sophisticated and determined adversaries, and that it is just a question of time that we will be the victim of a breach. That in of itself, although scary, is somewhat liberating. And I think it changes the perspective that one should have, or that a business should have as a living, breathing organism as it pertains to this problem. And therefore, what I think is of the utmost importance today is the recognition of that fact to be universally true, that you cannot create the impenetrable fortress, no matter how much you throw at it in terms of people, process, technology, and capital. And so by virtue of that fact, the discussion then shifts to the concept of risk. Risk mitigation and and in order to mitigate risk, risk understanding, awareness of your risk posture. The best way to deal with security, the best way to deal with risk and mitigate the challenges or the detrimental aspects of a security incident or a breach is to have holistic visibility, which most organizations and individuals certainly lack today. And that is demonstrated and evidenced by the fact that, back to my earlier point, the leading industry analysts concur that it's between 150 to 250 days, a 200-day median, let's just say for sake of argument, that a corporation, an enterprise, is able to detect that they've been the victim of a successful breach. Therefore, the ability to be able to detect and respond quickly is, in my humble opinion, the most forward way of thinking as it pertains to dealing with this question of cybersecurity and enterprise risk. And I think that if enterprises, and you know, to a lesser extent individuals, were to focus on implementing those types of controls and capabilities, they would be much better off.
And I'd like to get all of your responses to that, because the idealist in me is really upset and disheartened right now, because, you know, the idea of let's be, you know, to make it really rudimentary, and I don't want to minimize what you're saying, but to be reactive over proactive is really, you know, still going to be the nature of the beast. Do you agree with Carl that that should be still the kind of philosophical approach to the emerging concerns?
Well, you do have to accept the fact that the chances of you being breached are almost 100% at some point. But one thing we've had a lot of success with in the United States is we have, because of the way the United States Constitution was written, there was no way for the government and intelligence organizations and Federal Bureau of Investigation to provide either cyber or counterterrorism information out to individual companies. So we started these entities called Information Sharing Analysis Centers and Analysis Organizations, ISACs and ISALs. And within them, we could establish critical infrastructure, financial industry, telecommunications, various industry organizations. And within them, there's a non-disclosure that's signed. You subscribe to it, you're a member. All the vendors, cybersecurity vendors, can pump data out to you. Here's what you need to be looking at. Here's the threats. But also the intelligence community and law enforcement can communicate with you. You don't necessarily always want the FBI communicating with you, because then it's all out and you do not want your dirty laundry out there. But you can get a one-way feed down. And what else is great is when you're dealing with these organizations, somebody else gets hit somewhere else on the globe and they're a part of this organization. And we're able to say, okay, by the time the second person gets hit, one, we know how to stop it. Two, we rig the documents so that we can track the bad guys. We nail them before they get to the fourth and fifth victim. And you only get that by community sharing organizations with an NDA. I will add the non-disclosure is pretty important, but
So I'm going to try to mix it up a bit, because there's a bigger debate going on right now in terms of should organizations be adopting best practices, or should they be meeting minimum compliance requirements mandated by other regulations or laws of a jurisdiction? So I'll give you my editorial version on this because I have strong views about it. I think Canada is lagging in many ways compared to other jurisdictions. So when it comes to the United States, and I've given this example in previous presentations, is you typically have 48 states that have mandatory breach notifications. If a breach occurs, especially one which has consumer or personal information, then at that point you need to send a letter out or an email out indicating to them what's happened and so on. In the United States, just because of sort of the litigious nature of the industry that they have there and the type of manner in which they collect the information, if you're a journalist or a class action lawyer, you can go online, you can type in, data breach on the Attorney General's website in California or Massachusetts, which are typically the most active states, and you can either start litigation or you can report on it. So there's a very high level of sensitivity around it. In Europe, you have the General Data Protection Regulations, which will be kicking in May of 2018, and that is extremely significant for multiple reasons. I'll tell you why. In Canada, if you have a Canadian company which is selling whatever, apparel, shoes, or what have you through e-commerce, but has no brick and mortar location in Europe, but is selling to European data subjects, at that point it needs to comply with GDPR. So it's one of the very few pieces of legislations out there that are very, very strict in terms of when it comes to data protection, privacy as a general proposition, and which applies outside of its own jurisdiction to countries with severe penalties of up to 4% of global turnover. And the way it works right now is you have Canada, which has no mandatory breach notification, at least none that has been in place yet. There's discussion that will be coming in the first half of 2018, so we're behind. Canada is viewed as a jurisdiction which is adequate by European privacy standards, but that privacy standard or adequacy standard is not one which is eternal. So what happens is the European Commission will, on a regular basis, go through the different jurisdictions that they have listed as adequate and say, is Canada's privacy legislation up to speed with what we have? And if it's not, then we're not going to give them the adequate standard, and transferring data from one jurisdiction to another is going to be a problem for that country, a bit like it was for the safe harbor issue that happened between the US and the EU. So all this to say, there's a movement around the world to move very quickly towards stricter compliance requirements. So for example, GDPR requires threat risk analysis, or threat risk TRAs. They require PIAs, privacy impact assessments as well. Here, depending on which jurisdiction you're in, which industry you're operating, health or otherwise, you may or may not be required to do that. And I'll be honest with you, when I have a client who calls in, they go, well, am I required to do this? No, it would be better if you did it because it showed good, good corporate citizenship. It would show that your customers that you're doing it. Yeah, but do we have to do this?
And do they say that to save costs, or because they just go, well, if the government doesn't tell me I don't have to do it, I probably don't actually have to do it, and
Well,
you're just trying to bill me for something more? Like, what's their mindset on that?
There's a mix to it. There's a compliance issue where, is it required by law, and am I going to be offside? Am I going to be getting bad press? And second of all, sometimes it could be an issue of cost. Doing a full-fledged TRA can be quite costly and timely, can take up a lot of resources, and a lot of folks are going to say it's not worth it. But if you look at our critical infrastructure, if you go on public safety's website and you look at the 10 list of categories that they have in terms of identified as critical infrastructure, including health and financial services and others, you'll see that those are the industries that are typically heavily regulated, and they have a bit more regulation around what kind of protection they should have. So those areas I'm a bit more comfortable with, although I think everybody can improve. It's the other areas which are not viewed as critical infrastructure, which will still have an impact on society, in the cascading effect in many instances, where you want to have that additional level of compliance requirement. I am beyond the period where recommending best practices is going to be enough to compel an organization to take those steps. There's always an imperative. You touched about it earlier. You're doing a big M&A. The private equity firm in the U.S. is now demanding that you do an assessment. Now the Canadian company, just before they're going to be sold, are doing that assessment. They didn't do it over the past 10 years. There was a reason for that.
Stuart, how much more regulation do we need?
I can't speak to that for different reasons. I can speak at a higher level in terms of descriptive versus prescriptive regulatory oversight. Again, it stems back to operational considerations by the C-level, who have an understanding and are aware of these risks, versus these insurance companies that are providing the underwriting if they do get hit with a cyber occurrence, versus having the regulatory agency owning that accountability for providing regulatory oversight and putting in prescriptive measures saying thou shall disclose things, thou shall act in a certain fashion. there needs to be a measured balance. And I have seen Public Safety Canada's website, and they're very, very good in the way that they're approaching things. I think more, however, should be considered at this junction. And I did talk to Gary Caulfield and the ISAC team down in the United States who did the forensic on the Ukraine attack, and the wonderful things what they're doing with the fusion centers with NIST. And I'm hoping in very short order that we're going to adopt similar measures for information sharing and fusion centers here in Canada. But again, I can only speak within my current mandate as an individual here. But let me revisit some of the conversation pieces. Carl touched on it, and the other folks here touched on it. The biggest concern I see here is the gap in knowledge. We don't know what the impacts. It's impacting the ability at the board and the C-level who understand their operational risks, but they don't have any guidance on the cybersecurity risks in general. When we do these assessments, these are $500,000 to come in and do these PIOs and whatnot. And many of these C-levels, they're inundated on a daily basis with the fast one-page sound bites, at the same time lacking the corresponding in-depth understanding of the reports and knowledge that would actually lead to the material changes. The concern then is, what role would the regulator play in obligating the C-level to take appropriate actions? Mm-hmm. Again, that discussion needs to be taken at a higher level. There's dozens of things that can be done outside of the operational level without breaking laws, and to turn off an attacker's ability to execute on these threat vectors, including reducing your cyber inherent risks. The key here is to being informed. Information is needed at all levels, political, legal, and other actions, desired by these entities and their leadership teams, including legal counsel. I know in the United States, things like the kill chain methodology, which was based on, Top Gun, 1970s Department of Defense tactics. We've been using that effectively for response and recover measures to provide reactive measures. Early warning indicators, including, threat sharing, sharing across your peer groups and your KPIs and KPRIs, participating in those mock threat attacks like GridX are another. The fundamental criticality, however, is that translating that information security into a language that any board or C-level can understand and know at a glance, the risks and implications of those threats, that's the key. So when we're talking about, whether it's 100 days, 200 days, or 82 days that we've been breached, what are the steps you need to take? How do you want to respond and recover? And what regulatory oversight becomes almost an immaterial at that point. You basically have an operational risk you need to act upon.
There's one more thing I wanted to ask you guys about, and then we'll turn questions over to the audience. So get your questions ready. Start thinking about what you'd like to ask. Carl, for a lot of sort of members of the public or people just more generally interested in the topic, these comments, I think most of them reflected dealing with private sector clients. And the public is, of course, interested in that in terms of being patients and customers and their privacy and so forth. General public concerns also face kind of broader infrastructure issues, black swan things like a hacker going and compromising the water system, which we know has happened in Australia and other jurisdictions and so forth. What we've said today so far, does it translate? Is there really good crossover, or are they really two solitudes in dealing with those issues?
Crossover to what, the public sector or to the individual?
Go from these sort of private client concerns to broader, usually public sector issues in terms of when they become national security issues, public health, public safety, and so on.
And sorry, the question is?
Just in what way have the remarks we've been saying so far that are really primarily about private client issues, is it the whole same sort of attitude to approaching it, or do we need a completely different way of looking at those other problems?
Well, no, I think attitudes are definitely very different. In fact, I know that just in this forum, you've heard specifically at the previous panel and even on this one, there's a lot of talk about certain industries. A lot of discussion, particularly I think John talked about the maturity and the fact that he's sitting down with the financial institutions, banks, large insurance companies, the FIs. And the reason why everybody talks about the FIs, particularly in the context of Canada, is because without question, in my humble estimation, they are by far ahead of any other industry in terms of their overall security posture and awareness. They take the risk very seriously. They spend a very large sum of money on protecting their assets, on protecting their client data, on protecting their brand and business continuity. And that's why, frankly speaking, I think, the point about regulation, notwithstanding everybody wanting or hoping that you're going to be a good corporate citizen or corporate steward, the banks and the insurance companies have had regulatory compliance in place for many years that forced their hand to go down this path, well and beyond the question of cybersecurity ever became a front page issue on the Globe or on the Post. Is there translation? I think that's always relevant to the industry type. I think that, frankly speaking, I can't tell you how many discussions I've had with CIOs, CISOs, Chief Information Security Officers, of organizations of all different shapes, sizes, and stripes, whether that be in healthcare, whether that be in mining, whether that be in manufacturing. And, one of the questions that was raised, to be fair, more so, let's say a year ago than it is now, is why should I spend? I'm trying to sell you something, I'm trying to sell you a solution, I'm trying to mitigate risk, and this question of, do I have to do it? Back to what you had posited to Imran, do I have to do it? And the response being, we're not a bank, we're not an insurance company. Who on earth would ever want to target us? And I think that you take that and you combine it with a general, and again, sorry to burst your bubble of idealism and optimism. And it's not that I'm not an optimist. Far,
I'm not actually an idealist.
Just to the comment. Not you specifically, but to your comment. And again, to support what Imran had said, I believe that Canadian enterprise and in general, Canadians are far behind, certainly our U.S. counterparts and our global counterparts as it pertains to our awareness and acceptance of the security risks and challenges that face us today. And there is a general feeling that for whatever reason, Canada is not a target, that Canadian institutions are not a target, or at least not nearly as big a target as their U.S. counterparts. The U.S. being our closest neighbor and ally, so the relevant point of comparison. That's a problem. And I fear that what will have to happen, as is so often the case, is there will need to be a major breach that has severe impact and repercussions to such a level that will then force people down a path where they start to take, I think, this challenge a little bit more seriously and understand that, we are very much at risk, and being here in Canada and not having the current administration as our own that seems to be attracting a lot of ear from the global community does not insulate us from the risks that are truly global and universal in nature. And if we change that mindset, is it a question of government changing the mindset in terms of regulation? I think government has a role to play. But I think that, again, we've seen in the United States, we talk about the ISACs. I'm very familiar with the FSISAC. They've done a phenomenal job. We don't have that infrastructure, or should I say, the infrastructure that we have here is not nearly as strong or cohesive in Canada as exists in the United States. And I think in many ways the United States is a model for us to look at, and we should absolutely be perhaps cooperating more or taking direction from our U.S. counterparts in terms of their approach to this challenge.
Liz, did you have anything you wanted to add to that, or the interplay between the sort of bigger, doom and gloom civilizational concerns and the private consulting ones?
One of the things, coming from national security and military background, we had a different budget to play with, and we obviously have completely different concerns than you would for a financial institution or other organizations other than public utilities. So set them aside for a minute. One of the things, we originally had pushed our financial institutions and financial regulations ahead, and then we got them halfway decent, and then we started looking at healthcare because we wanted electronic medical records. And we realized we were installing Wi-Fi and iPads, and doctors are walking around instead of having a PDR on your physician's desk reference on your, they have it on your tablet or your phone. And so you started introducing all these bring your own devices, and it created problems in the hospitals, and then we got ransomware. So we started pushing forward security and compliance standards within healthcare that are now, in my opinion, some of the top ones that we have now in the United States. And what I advise financial institutions, and I've specifically told the FSISAC, look at how healthcare is right now. This is where your compliance and regulations are going to go to. And one of the big issues that I've seen is, as far as our Health and Human Services, how they issue penalties when there's a data breach. The more you've done to get ahead of it, the more transparent you are, the more you've done to help your customer after the fact, the lower your penalties and fines end up being. And I think that's what's going to happen in the financial industries, and I think other industries are going to end up, their regulatory groups are going to end up adopting that. The more helpful you are and the more you're trying to clean up and be a good citizen and be good to your customers, you're going to reduce your litigation liabilities there and your penalties and fines.
Imran, did you have anything to add to that?
So I'm going to make a suggestion here in terms of where Canada should be going. I think we are laggards in many ways when it comes to cybersecurity, in addition to the US, which I agree. I think we should also look to Israel as an example because they're far ahead of us, not only in terms of defenses, but in terms of how they train their youth in being ready. And that's a skill set and an innovation opportunity for us as a Canadian country.
Is cybersecurity a part of the mandatory IDF training, or would you have to go into a specialty within it? Like, do they all get some degree of it?
I'm not familiar with the specifics in terms of the curriculum, but I can tell you there's a very large number of folks coming out of the military who are then starting out great companies or who are innovating or who are doing things. I think the biggest challenge Israel is having right now is finding qualified people because they can scale up much faster in terms of their private sector space. But they're by far a model to look at in addition to the US. But I think we should look at a model like Australia where we do have a cybersecurity czar who's going to be leading cybersecurity. I think public safety right now, Minister Goodale is mandated with cybersecurity under the ministerial mandate letter he received from the Prime Minister. That's great, but I feel he's distracted because the pace at which the consultation went through and the strategies being rolled out and so on, we're 2 years into a mandate and no real concrete results coming out of it. You compare, for example, the 10 categories of critical infrastructures that we have. That's great, but when you compare that to the US DHS standards of 16 categories with the guidelines they have, it's a complete day and night kind of situation. So I think we're moving very slowly. The last piece I'll add, and I feel I'm being a bit negative here, but it is the reality of what we're seeing here. Foreign Affairs magazine had an article not too long ago which said that a lot of the hackers, especially those who are state-sponsored, who would be interested in compromising US critical infrastructures, are testing Canada as a proxy because of the intertwined, interconnected nature of our networks, may it be on oil and gas or pipelines, electrical grids, port authorities, maritime, and so on. For us to take this so lightly, and I'll tell you, there are some organizations which are doing cutting-edge work, but there is a big chunk of organizations, it's a mixed bag, where when you go down sort of the total pole in terms of revenue size and scale, which are not investing the same level. Critical infrastructure includes hospitals. And if you go talk to somebody in Northern Ontario at a hospital for acute care, if it goes down, how much have they actually invested in terms of cybersecurity? It's actually quite shocking and startling in many ways. So you go down in all of those critical infrastructure categories that they have on public safety's website, and I feel that they're not investing enough. So I think a cybersecurity is our model on the Australian model that they have would be a very good first step to go in that direction, and it would report and liaise with all of our intelligence agencies.
Right. There was some talk about the need for international coordination. I mean, that's obvious, that's clear, I should say. But there's also a need for domestic coordination because you got the Securities Commission, you got the federal jurisdiction, provincial jurisdiction, you have OSFI, the RCMP, CSIS, the police. I think we're in the infancy of policy development on a subject that has such broad implications in so many different areas where there's a real risk of jurisdictional gaps and frankly probably a lack of expertise on the part of policymakers and in spite of the people here and in spite of the people we've heard from, probably a lack of expertise on the part of public servants who may have responsibilities that touch on some of these issues. So I think, also, we've got to, this is a subject that has been discussed elsewhere, but, if countries are ahead of us, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We need to see whether it works. The Americans are clearly ahead in some respects. The Israelis are doing things that we can learn from, and I'm sure there are other countries as well. We should find out, get the best possible standards wherever they may be found, and we know that some of our enemies are doing that, and some of our competitors, and who our competitors and our enemies are in some cases are not entirely clear. So I don't know, does anyone have other questions, suggestions, ideas to raise? If not, thank you all so very much for attending. Thank you all for the speakers. I think this has been a very interesting and useful session. I just want to mention that I guess experts from today's conference will be posted on the Mackenzie Institute's website, and I'll note that the next session sponsored by the Mackenzie Institute will be on the subject of positioning for peace preservation, which will be held on November 30th at the RCMI. And thank you again for coming. The meeting's adjourned.